Kia ora koutou, and welcome to Ōtautahi City Voices, where we listen to Ōtautahi during the COVID-19 pandemic by interviewing city makers and community leaders. We're interested in hearing from a diversity of voices about what people discovered under lockdown and how it influenced or galvanised their vision for Ōtautahi Christchurch. I'm Jessica Halliday. I'm the director of Te Pūtahi Centre for Architecture and City Making. And today I'm talking with Maggy Tai Rakena, the manager of Sexual Violence Service START. Kia ora, Maggy.
Ngā mihi mahana ki a koe, Jess.
Welcome, and thank you so much for being part of Ōtautahi City Voices. It would be great if you could start us off by telling us something about who you are, what you do, and what your passion is.
Well, kia ora koutou. I'm a Cantabrian, and my day job is to manage an NGO, social service organisation, which, as you said, specialises in the field of sexual violence recovery work. So we work with children, youth and adults, and this organisation's done that work for 33 years. I've personally been here for not quite that long, but nearly. So that's what we do in the world, and we focus down on that piece of work, but because it's so specialised, we're connected up with the national networks in the sexual violence arena and belong to a few national wider bodies and social services as well.
So would you say your passion is helping people to heal?
I have a few passions, but that's definitely one of them. I'm particularly passionate about children and young people, but healthy families and people, equity, having a chance to get their needs met, and also for people to be free to be who they are with equitable opportunities. So yeah, thinking about disparities.
So we're doing these interviews in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And currently, during this recording, Christchurch is at level 2. It's the end of August 2020. And I would like you to think back to when Christchurch was in full lockdown, back in April and May. Could you tell us a little bit about just what part of the city you were in during lockdown?
So I work from home and I live in St Albans, and not far from Jessica. And so my work is also in St Albans, so it's a side of town I just happen to be quite familiar with. So lockdown for me, I manage this agency, and so we very quickly had to get up to speed with what were we going to be able to offer people. We were deemed an essential service for some elements of the work that we provide, which is the more crisis-orientated stuff. But we normally, our main work is counselling for victims. And so we needed to think about how we could do that. So we kind of had some of the wherewithal, but we very quickly had to get ready to do online counselling services. So lockdown 4 for me was getting ready for everybody to be able to do that, to get our team off-site and in their homes and set up with the equipment, and then coaching them through. So very quickly, probably in about the second week, I was also became involved in some national pandemic working groups with the government, with the family violence and sexual violence sectors, working closely about those immediate needs. So my lockdown was crazy. It was really, really busy, really hectic. I kept running into people who were talking about how bored they were and how they'd quite like something to do, and I felt like I had rather too much to do. But we had some very fabulous outcomes of that. Collaborative work is always really productive when done well, and we were able to get some really good heads in the room and thinking about solutions to some pretty big and gnarly problems. So yeah, I enjoyed that work, but 7 hours of Zooms back to back in a day on a regular basis was pretty exhausting.
Yeah, look, I don't think in this series that we've yet spoken to someone who was working quite so much during lockdown as you were possibly. Do you feel that you still had an opportunity to discover or learn something new about your neighbourhood or the city during lockdown?
I found it a really special time. I'm blessed with having the freedom to work at home, the privilege of working at home, having the equipment and the space, not having to share my space with many other people. So I worked out pretty quickly, as I guess it's part of a hallmark of, I'm a registered social worker by trade. And so we know about self-care and thinking about yourself in a trauma space. So making sure I was having breaks, making sure I was getting lots of exercise, getting outside, enjoying the sunshine, doing some gardening and things. So really trying to remember to break up my day and to eat properly, things that are very easy to let slip. I had food deliveries already going on with a commercial company before lockdown, but they certainly came into their own then, and I had lots of lovely people delivering me groceries and stuff, which I really appreciated. So what I learned about how important routine is, and how important it is to do your basic health stuff. I learned a lot about being in I decided to do my front garden, I noticed, instead of my back every day, because what that enabled me to do was engage with other human beings, even if literally they never saw me, because I'd be nose down, bum up in the garden, but there'd be all sorts of life on the street. And I absolutely delighted in watching people chill, engage, chat, relax, talk to their families and kids, and take the time to go for big walks. And I saw so much health. I know it's not like that for everybody. There were lots of different experiences because of my day job. I'm finding out about all the abusive experiences, the unsafe experiences for people being locked at home. But the counter and the foil for me was to see so much health visibly out on the street.
So much health.
Health, like well-being, interactions, healthy relationships, chatting. Doing what families do when they're not rushing 100 miles an hour. And they were taking some exercise and they were enjoying the sunshine.
And I think it's an interesting observation, because it's certainly something I saw during lockdown as well, was you suddenly realize how unusual it is to see a family walking down the street together. You know, not just one or two of them walking the dog, but the whole family. And it makes you very aware of the fact that possibly a lot of households, when they leave the house together, they leave the house in a car. They don't necessarily leave the house on foot together. So that was I found that really surprising.
Well, we've had reflections, in particular people in our culture, as opposed to, say, even what I see in Europe, but in lots of more collective cultures, is that the teenagers naturally don't want to be around the parents. They're doing that individuating. That's actually the task, the developmental task of adolescence. But we saw loads of adolescents out walking with their parents, sometimes one-on-ones, having a chat, and sometimes as a whole group. And the reflections professionally into our workspace is that lots of teenagers actually loved the amount of access they had to their family and to their adults, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? That they obviously perceive there's not enough time to have those relaxed chats. And for some of the children that we work with, or youth, they found it harder to go back to school and life and the normal routines, because they quite like that bit about being at home and being with people who had the time to chat to you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, of course, you've already mentioned your knowledge about, hearing now about increased violence and unsafe situations during lockdown. But do you have any other fears, or what are you most worried about as a result of the pandemic?
I have to couch this in the reality that we're in level 2, and a lot of my national work, I'm talking with people who are in level 3, and also internationally with people who are in all sorts of variations of lockdowns. And I'm really noticing how kind of in another, we're kind of in a bubble, a time warp, a space warp in Christchurch, and that we're just getting about our life really. And we're not particularly taking a lot of notice of COVID this time round. And it's still so very real and so present and so anxious creating in so many other places that I'm talking to people, which is good for me to have that reminder. So the fears I hold is, I guess the things that we all hold is the social inequities are just exacerbated, and the difference between those who have and those who have not will become increased. I don't think for 1 minute we've seen the real social impacts yet in terms of their wage subsidy still being in place. So most in my sector are kind of poised for things to get worse once the subsidies come off. So that's a concern. I'm old enough to remember well the last big recession in the 80s and the impacts of that on lots of families and the distress. So we saw nationwide there was a police stat change of about 20% increase in family violence. One of the local Christchurch services had a 35% increase in family violence. So, and that's what you know about. There's always so much more that's never reported. So people in stress and not managing, not being able to live a normal life does make for a lot of problems. And the eyes not being over, I guess my passion for the children is, you know, a lot of the work in the pandemic working group that I was involved in is who's watching the kids? How are the kids getting help if they're worried? Because they haven't got the usual people there that would spot their distress, their school teachers and the like. And we watched really carefully the school reopening kind of conversations and things like that, because there's a lot of risks in having your schools closed. So I fear for those disparities being increased and just continuing to build. And there's lots of vulnerable groups that we know about in there, and it's pretty predictable that life will probably not get better for them anytime soon. So I don't kind of angst myself out about economic crisis, but it does happen to be a reality that we have to think about.
Mm. So the converse question really is, does this experience of the pandemic lead you to have a new hope or dream for Ōtautahi Christchurch? Can you see new potential for the city now? Or has it simply galvanised the hopes and dreams that you already had?
I think it's impossible in Ōtautahi to think about the lockdown and isolation from the other things that we have lived through, because they're not separate in lots of ways. The trauma and the distress that our city has navigated is cumulative, and what we know about cumulative stress is it builds into something else. So we've journeyed a hell of a lot of harsh stuff together, and it's changed us as a people, it's changed us as a cohort. And I'm not convinced that the people of Canterbury actually even know that. I just get windows of it when I'm doing my national and international work. And like in that pandemic working group stuff, I'd often say, you know, try this, that, or the next thing that we might have tried here, not because we've got all the answers. And it was kind of like a major revelation to other cities. And I thought, oh gosh, people here would think it was pretty ordinary and normal. Like, we're a collaboration city. It doesn't happen in other cities. And we probably blindly think this is what the new world is, but it ain't. And one particular large family violence service coming to the revelation that they actually needed to collaborate with some other services because they're drowning in their workload. And I'm kind of like, oh, so you've just worked that out. You know, like, it was a surprise to me because collaboration is our norm here. We're very collaboratively orientated, and there's many fine examples. And there, once you do collaborations, you realise there isn't actually any other way to do things effectively. So Canterbury has got a different way to which we've entered this particular dilemma, and I think it's meant that things have been at some levels easier for us. Because we've got a lot of systems and structures in place, and I know the system locally really thoroughly, we know who to call on, we know immediately where to get the answers, where to get the help. That's the positive. The flip side of that is we have had a lot of calamities. So the accumulation of calamities means that people's resilience is, you know, getting pretty battered. So for some, the vulnerable will be more vulnerable, and there's new vulnerable people that have never been vulnerable before, but perhaps have lost their job or, you know, having to sell their home, things that they might have never thought would happen. So the different thing about COVID, I guess, was those revelations that my observation of families having more family time and having a slower pace and them enjoying it. And I heard some younger people than me, everybody's younger than me, but I'd say they were families probably in their early 30s, reflecting on life without running around. They had never experienced that, and that your kids don't have to do 75 activities, and they don't have to go to a club every night, and you're not a poor parent if you don't do that. You know, that you can still do some good parenting by going home and blowing out. And I thought they'd never known that you don't have to. People my age didn't used to. We know that. That was a return to a former life for us. But for some people, it's a different thing. It's something they've never experienced before, and they decided they quite liked that. I imagine it won't happen overnight, but I imagine some people have changed some parts about their life, or they've judged for themselves whether they actually need to spend so much money and go to the mall and chase after those material things to the same extent.
Yeah.
Because they probably saved a lot of money and probably decided that they probably didn't miss it as much as they thought they would.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So your sense is that Christchurch is already a collaborative city. That's become the norm now, and possibly the pandemic is reinforcing that. And that the other thing is that the potential to have maybe a calmer, quieter sort of life that is still rewarding and possibly more rewarding. That's a really wonderful thing to hold for the city now.
Well, people often talk about Canterbury when I'm out of Canterbury about, yeah, you guys are good at collaborating. This is in our sector, so I'm only reflecting on the part that I know. It's all right for you guys in Canterbury. You're good collaborators because you had the earthquake, so you had to. And I'm kind of like, and we really dug into this, and I thought, no, our collaboration started before the earthquake. It was because of our collaborations in our sector, which we had forged the hard way through some troubles. Between, you know, government funding cuts and all this sort of thing, and I was trying to figure out how we're going to keep going. And that absolutely stood us in the best stead possible in the earthquakes. And so once again, we know that, you know, the learnings from the earthquakes came to bear following March 15, and the great structure that were in place in the schools immediately, having the manaaki workers there for the kids. There were just lots of ways on which people already had some things there, and they knew how to go about getting the help that they needed.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear about, Maggie. Thank you for that. It's been really good to hear from you today. You've certainly brought a completely new perspective to the city for me and to lockdown, and I really value your time. So how do people find you or the organisation you work with online?
So the person who pays my salary, well, the organisation is Start. There's a few other jobs I have, but Start is, we have a website, www.starthealing.org, and anybody can make a referral to our services if they've had an experience of sexual violence, or if you're just trying to figure out a particular problem in that area that you want help with, we can direct people. So the information is there anyway.
Great, thank you. It's been such a pleasure talking with you today. And thanks to those of you who are watching or listening. Please send us in your feedback, share your views, experiences, or vision for Ōtautahi now. We'd love to hear from you. So it's goodbye from Maggie.
Ngā mihi, Jessica.
And it's goodbye from me. Ka kite anō.